So hello, everybody, and welcome to this third session of Raja and Neil's book club. We are really honored today to be joined by Dr. Neil Aiton, who's going to introduce himself in a moment. In addition to being the author of the chapter about complex issues related to alcohol and pregnancy, Neil was also co-editor with Raja of the book that we're here to talk about, which is the Prevention, Recognition, and Management of FASD. Neil, I think I'm just going to turn it over to you. And if you want to share the slides, and we'll see how that goes.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be able to just talk a little bit at these series and I think share some of the information and some of the problems that we all experience and I think and I hope engender some debate and particularly about some of these particular issues we're going to talk about today in this particular chapter, which is the complex issues related to alcohol and pregnancy. And in the chapter, I've called it Evidence, Ethics and the Law, which sounds a bit, but I think it encompasses all of those things. And, you know, my general work as a neonatologist who has a particular interest in substance use in pregnancy and in the perinatal period. These are things which I come across in the context of my professional life, both within the worlds of substance use in our clinic that we have here in Brighton, but also sometimes in my general role as a neonatologist on the neonatal unit and in intensive care. So I'm going to try and share my screen with you for just a couple of slides, just to summarize, so you don't have to look at my face the whole time. But if I fail, I'm hoping Sandy will step in. I suppose this circle just summarizes, if I had more time, I'd have made it more jazzy and more interesting, but summarizes some of the kind of words that might pop into your mind around the issues of alcohol and pregnancy and some of the things that we've come up against in a real practical basis, both in terms of trying to introduce guidelines in pregnancy, but also thinking about, you know, the fact that we as individuals live in a free country. And that's a really important thing for us to hold on to when we see evidence of imposed things on populations where that isn't true. But I think as an individual and in my work as a pediatrician, I think we have to be aware of the fact that sometimes there are people who will decide and choose to do things differently. And, you know, my professional practice as a pediatrician, perhaps I come across that in immunizations. You know, and just to kind of give you an introduction to the sort of types of things without being emotive about alcohol in any way, you know, I absolutely accept the freedom for people to choose or not to choose to have their children immunized. But equally, as a professional and having looked at the evidence and all of the health issues myself, I can't understand why some people might choose not to do that, but I uphold their right to choose to do that. And I think some of those kind of ethical and moral issues, I think, come into some of the arguments and things that perhaps we might discuss today. But there's also things that impact on that. And we've particularly met that in a very real sense when trying to introduce the NICE guidelines in pregnancy, where I think certainly a group of women who are very supportive of, you know, very hard-won rights for women over the last few decades, you know, and felt that that was being threatened by some of the ways that women were being approached in pregnancy and asked about information and about how that information was transferred and shared. Having looked and thought about a lot of those issues at length and over time myself, I think there are ways that we can get around some of those concerns and acknowledge them. And I really hope that in time we will be able to develop and have a really nuanced debate about how we move forward in those particular areas. And with that, I think we've got to think about stigma, society, what the responsibilities of society are within those contexts. And when I say that, I'm talking about the responsibilities not only of us as individuals to help support and understand about women who might be in difficult situations in pregnancy, but also about the responsibility of society and health systems and social care systems to be able to marshal and provide the appropriate support that women sometimes need to help them to change and to progress. And I think that's where the debate needs to move forward, really. I divided the chapter up into kind of, I suppose, 4 broad areas, really. Looking at science and the evidence behind it, and why sometimes actually that can appear to be conflicting in terms of one's understanding about what research science shows. And, you know, we so often hear, and it just frustrates me immensely when I hear these headlines bouncing around, it's fine to drink in pregnancy. No, it's not fine to drink in pregnancy. And it kind of, these things bounce back and forwards all of the time. And whilst for many of you here will have a much clearer understanding of the outcomes of the implication of that, I think that certainly isn't the case in the sense of wider society. And so to just lump to the bottom of that point on that slide, in terms of changing societal attitudes and culture and driving forward improvements in public health, you know, it's taken us 20 to 30 years from understanding that cigarette smoking causes cancer and kills people to actually getting to the point where you know, people are free to smoke, and that's their choice, and that's fine. But on the other hand, where that impacts on other people, there might be limitations to that freedom to smoke. And you know, and about changing society's attitudes about, you know, understanding the health implications of that choice. So, you know, and perhaps we're on that similar journey with respect to alcohol in pregnancy as well, I would suggest. And I think we have to be patient that it takes time to create change, societal change. And into that comes the sort of ethical approach to maternal and fetal rights, which I've alluded to earlier. So just to begin to look at the science and the evidence I came across in the chapter, and I think probably would summarize the importance of the paradigm, which lens, how are you looking at this as a topic and a situation? Because that very much approaches the types of questions that you ask, and therefore, when you ask those questions of the evidence, the type of answer that you might find. And equally, you know, the different paradigms and approach that people have towards the way they look and assess evidence is often very different. You know, and people have different frameworks by which they approach those things. Where do most people get their evidence from? Well, actually, most people don't go to librarians and do systematic searches and look at meta-analyses and all of those sorts of things, which we're so accustomed to do in the research environment, and to try and be organized and about our approach and to try and be balanced in the best way. Most people get their evidence from their friends, or from their friends' experience, or their family, or what happened to them. And then I think sometimes we struggle to in the medical context, to understand the ways in which news and information travels across social media and the changing ways that people get news nowadays. And you know, I saw just earlier this week that the majority of adults under 25, only less than 25% of them would look at the BBC, for example, to get their news, and most would gain a lot of that information via social media sites such as Instagram and TikTok, for example. So I think it's not just which lens are you looking at this through to try and how you're approaching it, but actually, you know, what's the sources of your information and how are you accessing that? And there's lots of things wrapped up with that about, I would say, almost the way that information has been guarded in the past, you know, and even now there's massive issues. We spend lots of information with public money on grants to do research, and yet that information is still locked away behind access to published medical journals and things. And that still is something that frustrates me immensely and I think needs to improve. But there is encouraging movements towards driving to open access so that people can access that information. So I think perhaps professionals are becoming less the guardians of information, but perhaps have a role in helping people to sift and sort and work out what's important, and perhaps on interpretations. But in fact, even if you do all that, actually, what's your definition? And we had an experience of that ourselves with, you know, deciding what low alcohol in pregnancy was, and what do you mean by that? And actually, how many units does that mean? And what does the research say? And what did the meta-analysis say? And does that mean that drinking small amounts in pregnancy is fine? And, you know, there's all sorts of layers to that small little nugget, which I haven't got time to go into now, but you can see that it can potentially be a can of worms if we're not looking at those things carefully. And of course, interpretation can be tricky. How do you assess this study that says this and this that says this, and why are the findings different between those studies? And was it the way that it was done, or was it, you know, so there's sometimes scientific questions behind research that lead to different answers. And sometimes the headline that's given about a study isn't necessarily the main message of what that study actually says. So lots of complex issues there, really. So I looked at, within the chapter, reasons for these apparent conflicts, and I've covered some of those already. What are you actually looking for? And coming down to this issue of definitions, and then the problem that you've got science writers in the papers who want to, you know, they've got a little story about pregnancy and alcohol, they want their coverage, and they need to give it a strapline, a title, or something that's going to, you know, catch people's attention. And I give an example in the chapter about how an article in the Times, you know, where I actually had this correspondence with the scientific editor of the Times saying, did you really write that title? She said, no, I didn't. I wrote the article. She said, but the title, which came on the front page of the Sunday Times, was written by the overnight copy editor who was like arranging the page. And then you've got Mr. Evidence. He's the professor that everyone goes to about coronavirus and everything else when assessing evidence. Mr. David Spiegelhalter, many of you might recognize the name, who was also involved in commenting on that. And I sort of sent an email to him saying, did you really say that? And I was glad I was really cautious in that approach, because he was absolutely thunderous about, no, I didn't, I was misquoted and I'm taking that up with the Times. And, you know, and then of course, the online version changes so that within 12 hours or so, it's all changed. So those are just interesting little vignettes that give an example about how things can just get twisted and changed and misinterpreted. And then, of course, underlying all of that's the biological reasons why things are different. And I put the seesaw there because when things are happening that can cause damage in our bodies, there are always other aspects on the other side of the seesaw that can be protective factors. So some of us, for example, might be more resistant to cancer, or some of us might be more resistant to cellular damage through alcohol, for example, or things like antioxidants. You know, how many antioxidants are in your diet that help protect you against damage from things like alcohol that can cause damage at a cellular level. So there are biological reasons why there can be differences in the evidence that we find. And of course, genetically, we're different as well, and about how the genetics can be different. So maternal and fetal rights is an important issue, which I've alluded to at the beginning. And these things are not always in harmony. How do we balance these? And I underline 4 ethical principles where and how we can approach this problem and look at it. It's just one way of analysis, and there are other ways of looking at these problems. And of course, the law is different in different countries. And it's really important, I think, in this country that the rights of the fetus really do not exist in law until a baby is born. But of course, many of us appreciate that the fetus has increasing moral and ethical rights as pregnancy progresses. But in law, that doesn't exist, because otherwise you have the potential, which has happened in other countries, of criminalization. And of course, that has lots of unintended consequences. So very well-meaning attempts to try and stop drinking in pregnancy and all of those sort of things can have unintended outcomes by driving things underground, meaning that people can't seek help because they're aware of the consequences of stigmatization, and that can actually make things worse. And through all of the last 10 minutes or so, I've been talking about attitudes, the need for a supportive approach, not a punitive approach, to women who need help in pregnancy, to change from the Daily Mail headline of, well, that's what happens if you take alcohol and or drugs or whatever, to one that is supportive and helps women to change. And of course, within that need is the need to drive public health forward, to reduce the number of children ultimately who will be affected by being exposed to alcohol in pregnancy. Yes, we have freedom, but it's, the Downing Street made the press a few years ago by installing its nudge unit, it called it, which has now been sold off actually. But it's trying to look for the best benefit for all and trying to help to drive positive change. So just to round off, I think that whilst we could do a lot better, it isn't entirely possible to completely prevent, I think, children being affected by fetal alcohol exposure in pregnancy, although we can do much better than we do at the moment. We definitely need a more nuanced debate with understanding of each other's positions, and I think in that area we've all got a part to play in helping to drive forward policy change, and National FASD has been really positive in that aspect, and I think really deserves applaud from that perspective. But it's about how that debate is conducted online and in social media as well. It's really important that we're, are adults and help to understand others' positions and not get driven into extremist shouting matches. So I think the future's bright, but it'll take time, and that's frustrating. And I'll stop there.
Right. Thanks so much, Neil. That's as you say, it's a very complex issue to try to get through in 15 minutes. But as always, we appreciate your expertise and your sensitivity based on all those years of experience. At this point, I'm going to end the recording. Before I end the recording, I would just want to point out that we do have on our YouTube channel the prior editions of this book club series, and the upcoming ones, which will be the next two, are we're having Dr. Alan Price talking about how our understanding of FASD has progressed. He's a researcher who's been doing great work and is going to be back at Salford University, as I understand it, in the autumn. That one's on the 16th of August. And then on the 16th of September, we have Professor Anna Hanlon-Dearman from the University of Manitoba in Canada talking about how FASD presents across the lifespan. So those are the upcoming sessions. So at this point, I'd just like to thank you formally for the video, and don't go anywhere, anyone, because we'll be having a Q&A in a moment.